Since I can remember, I've always been fascinated by detective and crime stories where one tiny piece of evidence helps to solve a case. That probably won't come as a surprise to those of you who've been watching for a while now. However, today's story has one of the most unusual kinds of these details that I think I've ever heard of. In fact, today's case has quite a few of these sort of what are the chances moments. A lot of things with pretty unlikely odds had to line up for this one to come together. But again, it all started with this one seemingly very minor discovery that would have been all too easy to overlook. It's a good thing it wasn't, because, as we'll see, it turned out to be enormously consequential. Without it, an incredibly dangerous and sick person might never have been taken off the streets. On the morning of September 13th, 2005, a sanitation worker was in the middle of his shift when something caught his eye. He was walking through a section of the city landfill in Lubbock, Texas, when he spotted a black suitcase sitting on top of one of the piles of waste. The suitcase was pretty easy to see. It was in an area where garbage was dropped off before being crushed into the main landfill, though there was a specific reason it stood out. To the worker, the thing looked like it might have been brand new. Something about this compelled the worker to check it out, so he walked over and took a closer look. As he started to unzip the main compartment, he could tell that there was something large and fairly heavy inside. For a split second, the worker thought it might be a mannequin, maybe someone's sick idea of a practical joke. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case. Instead, this was the body of an all-too-real young woman. She was completely unclothed, had been squeezed into the suitcase in the fetal position, and had obviously been the victim of a vicious attack. After being called to the scene, Lubbock police almost immediately realized that this was going to be a difficult case. In addition to having no clothes, the woman didn't have ID of any kind either, so already they were at a major disadvantage. The same was true in terms of evidence. If there was more to be found here, it was buried somewhere in this giant pile of garbage. Even in this more restricted search area, finding anything would be a tall order. And then, of course, even if they did, there was a strong possibility it had already been contaminated. Still, based on the limited amount police were able to find, it seemed clear that this is not where the actual crime had happened. With that, the female victim's body and the suitcase were taken away for further analysis. During an autopsy, the medical examiner pieced together the awful details of the young woman's death. She had at least 50 blunt force injuries across her head, body, and limbs, as well as ligature strangulation marks to her neck. As if this weren't bad enough, the woman had bruises and multiple injuries to her inner thigh and groin areas, telltale signs of a violent sexual assault. Unbelievably, though, this still wasn't the worst of it. There were two other details that were so nightmarish that they were difficult for even the most experienced investigators on the team to stomach. For starters, while the woman had died from a combination of blunt force trauma and asphyxiation, the medical examiner said that they were unable to determine which specific injury had killed her. As a result, they said that the most likely scenario was that she had actually died of positional asphyxia. In other words, she was still alive when she was put into that suitcase, and it had restricted her so that she was unable to breathe. She had then died sometime between then and when she was found at the landfill. Based on the condition of the body, the ME guessed that this had only happened somewhere in the last 24 to 48 hours. The second detail was no less haunting. The woman was between 5 to 10 weeks pregnant at the time that she was killed. As gut-wrenching as all of this was, it was during the autopsy that police also got their first real lead. The female victim had a tattoo on one of her ankles that said Summer. This turned out to be her name. When they ran her fingerprints through the motor vehicle database, they came back as a match to a 29-year-old woman named Summer Baldwin. If you've watched our videos before, you'll know that this is normally the part where I would dig into Summer's life and tell you all about her. I would argue it's the most important section of any of our stories. You know, it's what humanizes all of this and puts everything into perspective. But one of the real tragedies of this case is that very little is known about Summer. Sadly, it feels like a lot of the reason for this is that Summer struggled with drug addiction and was involved in sex work at the time of her murder. It's pretty clear from news reports at the time that no one in the media was really interested in digging deeper into who she was. These same two details about drugs and sex work were repeated over and over and over again, but they never really included anything about her life, which is heartbreaking. That being said, here's the small amount of information we were able to find. Summer was born in Tacoma, Washington in August of 1976. She grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, and by all accounts was a very warm and joyful person. She made friends easily and had a bright and beautiful smile. According to her family, one of the things that she was most known for was her contagious laugh. She was always the first person to break out laughing whenever something funny would happen, and she would get everyone else started up as well. As Summer got older, she developed an interest in cosmetology and eventually went to school for it. Sources contradict each other about when exactly she moved to Lubbock, with some saying it had been 3 years at the time of her death, while others state that she had only arrived there recently. However, it does seem that she had some family in the area. Her Aunt Terry, who was supposedly like a second mother to her. It's not clear when Summer began to struggle with drug addiction, though one of the reports we came across mentioned that she had spent a brief time in jail related to this. She also had a young son who she loved very much and who she appears to have been taking care of all on her own. As for Summer's other family, her parents lived back in Washington at the time. Her mother, Yuva Roback, admitted in interviews that we came across that she didn't know a ton about her daughter's life in Lubbock, but that they still kept in regular contact. I think it's also worth hammering home just how devastated Summer's family was when they found out what had happened, especially since Summer was Yuva's only child. Understandably, the fact that Summer didn't have a ton of family locally did pose a potential problem for investigators. Luckily, they were able to quickly track down a friend of hers named Margie Estrada, who had some important information. Margie explained that she had actually run into Summer by chance a couple of nights before her body was found, on Sunday, September 11th. At the time, she was walking out of a 7-Eleven store at the intersection of Avenue Q and 8th Street. She guessed it was somewhere between 11:30 and midnight. Margie said that the pair of them hadn't talked for long because Summer was with a guy. She said she hadn't really gotten a great look at the man because he was sitting in his vehicle, but he appeared to be pretty young, had short hair, and seemed to be decently good looking. The thing she really remembered, though, was the vehicle. The man had been behind the wheel of what looked to be a new red pickup truck. This helped to narrow the timeline significantly, and it provided police with a real suspect. Whoever this person was, he was almost certainly the last person to see Summer alive. Of course, if investigators were going to identify him, they were going to need more than a vague description of a vehicle. You know, red pickup trucks aren't exactly uncommon in Texas, and Margie hadn't gotten the license plate. Fortunately, police were about to get something a lot more conclusive. It may not have seemed like it at first, but this was something that would turn out to be the key to the entire case. After speaking with Margie and hearing about the mystery man that Summer had been spotted with the last time she was seen alive, detectives with the Lubbock Police Department knew that they needed more clues. They had learned just about everything they could from Summer's autopsy, so instead, they turned to the only other real source of evidence they had, the suitcase that she had been found in. Now, unsurprisingly, when investigators first analyzed the bag, they were hopeful that they would find physical evidence. You know, fingerprints, DNA, hair belonging to the killer, stuff like that. But it became clear early on that this wasn't going to happen. Whoever had done this had taken steps to cover their tracks. All of the DNA, blood, and other evidence found in the suitcase belonged to Summer Baldwin. Still, just like the sanitation worker that had originally found it, police were convinced that the suitcase was new. It may have been covered in grime on the outside from the time it had spent in the landfill, but the thing was very clean on the inside and showed almost no signs of wear and tear. In fact, you know that tissue paper that you normally find stuffed into bags like this when you first buy them? Well, there was still a bunch of it in some of the smaller compartments. Similar to the lack of physical evidence, it was obvious that the killer had tried to rip out all of the identifying tags and inserts from the suitcase. Initially, it looked like they had been successful. That was, until detectives noticed it. a little tag that was tucked into one of the creases of the lining. On it was a UPC code. This might not sound like a big deal, and it's one of those things that most people don't really ever stop to think about, but UPCs, or Universal Product Codes, do a lot more than just tell you how expensive something is when you scan it at a store checkout. It differs depending on the item, but that string of 12 numbers can contain a bunch of information, including stuff about the manufacturer, the item's size and weight, the facility where it was produced, and more. On top of this, a UPC is unique to that product, so every time a company creates a new item for sale, it gets assigned its own code. This helps with tracking products throughout the global supply chain, as well as with things like inventory for retailers. Once police found this, and because they knew the suitcase had probably been purchased very recently, they took the UPC and started reaching out to local businesses. It turned out that only one place in the area sold this particular model: Walmart. Detectives went to the closest store near where Summer had last been seen, and they were able to obtain sales records between that time and when her body had been found. As it happened, only 2 people had bought this suitcase during that window. The first person was easily ruled out. It was an older woman who needed the suitcase for an upcoming family vacation. When detectives looked at surveillance footage for the second purchase, though, it gave them chills. The footage was grainy, but even so, police could see that the man in the video matched the basic description they had been given by Margie. He appeared calm and strolled through the store as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. In addition to the suitcase, he purchased one other very unsettling item: a pack of latex gloves. By this point, investigators were already convinced they were on the right track, but what they saw next made them absolutely certain. As they scanned the store's exterior cameras, they watched as the man left and headed out into the parking lot. He walked straight up to a red pickup truck, got inside, and drove off. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention, all of this, it happened at 3:30 in the morning on September 12th, so just hours after Summer had run into Margie. Already, this was an incredible run of good luck for police. They had found the UPC, only one retailer carried the suitcase, and it happened to be a Walmart that had captured tons of useful security footage. However, things were about to get even crazier. I mentioned that pair of latex gloves. Well, the suspect had paid for them with a debit card. Investigators were able to subpoena the information attached to it, revealing the person who owned it. That wasn't actually the crazy part, though. No, that came when police looked at the name associated with the card. You see, they recognized this name, and it was for a pretty unsettling reason. On the morning of May 4th, 2004, so about 16 months before the murder of Summer Baldwin, a woman named Catherine Rogers was in the middle of her usual weekday routine when she realized it was time to wake up her 16-year-old daughter, Joanna, for school. It was about 7 a.m., and as far as she was aware, it was a normal Tuesday. That was, until she actually opened up her daughter's bedroom door. When she did, there was no sign of Joanna anywhere. Now, Joanna had definitely been there the night before. She had worked fairly late at a local sandwich shop where she had a part-time job, but she had come home just before 12:30 a.m. When she got in, she told her parents she loved them and hugged and kissed them goodnight before heading into her room. During the night, Catherine and her husband, Joe Bill, hadn't heard any strange noises, nor had the family's 2 dogs barked at all. Catherine was immediately worried because she didn't think Joanna had left the house early for school. She would have been tired from work, and on top of this, she hadn't taken any of her stuff. Her wallet, car keys, cell phone, her favorite coat, they were all still there. Catherine and Joe Bill alerted police, whose initial assumption was that Joanna was simply acting out. However, they quickly came around when they checked all of her friends' houses and confirmed that none of them had heard from her either. Over the following days and weeks, a massive search effort was launched for Joanna in and around the Lubbock area, involving hundreds of volunteers. Flyers were passed out, appeals were made on nightly news broadcasts, and everyone hoped there would be some kind of innocent explanation for all of this. But sadly, Joanna never returned home. Given her age and the suspicious circumstances of her disappearance, it didn't take long for police to conclude that foul play was likely involved. At first, they focused on Joanna's boyfriend, another teen from the local area. However, he was soon ruled out. That's when investigators found something that would make the case a whole lot more complicated. It turned out that at the time she went missing, Joanna had something of a secret life. In her spare time, she was spending hours online communicating with older men. Her chat history showed that she had been in contact with over 100 people. One of those people was a 25-year-old man named Rosendo Rodriguez. And it was Rosendo's name which Lubbock police had now found on that debit card linked to the Summer Baldwin murder nearly a year and a half after Joanna's disappearance. Rosendo Rodriguez lived in San Antonio, but he was originally from the city of Wichita Falls. He was the son of a local attorney and, by all indications, appeared to have a promising future ahead of him. He was a recent graduate of Texas Tech University and had since joined the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. He also had no criminal record to speak of. Still, you might be wondering, if Rosendo was on that list of guys that had been communicating with Joanna Rogers before she went missing, why wasn't he spoken to? Well, there were a couple of reasons. I should say that all of the men were considered suspects, but wading through that list of Joanna's contacts proved to be difficult and time-consuming. As I mentioned, there were over 100 people she was talking to, and all investigators really had for most of them were screen names. So police first had to figure out all of their identities one by one before attempting to contact them. The majority of these people weren't from the local area, so interviewing them wasn't a straightforward process either. And then, even when they did get in contact with them, as you might imagine, very few of them were forthcoming about why they were talking to a 16-year-old girl on the internet. Now, Rosendo's name was one of the ones that police had initially gotten to, but when they tried to contact him, he was away for military training. Since there were no other red flags in his history at that point, his name had kind of gone to the bottom of the list to be looked at again later. Like I said, the process was very slow and tedious, so even by the time Summer Baldwin was killed, it appears detectives working the Joanna Rogers disappearance still hadn't quite gotten to the end of the list. Of course, their focus immediately changed once the two cases were connected. Speaking of Rosendo's military service, that would quickly come up once again when detectives delved further into his life and background. They discovered that he had actually been in Lubbock on the night that Summer was last seen. That weekend, Rosendo was in town for Marine Corps Reserve training, and he was supposed to be staying at a Holiday Inn. Interestingly, though, when police looked into this, they learned that he had checked himself into a completely different Holiday Inn several miles from the one where the rest of his platoon was staying. It was located right across the street from that 7-Eleven where Margie Estrada had seen Summer on the night of September 11th. Upon discovering this, detectives rushed over to the hotel. Even though it was now several days later, they hoped that they might be able to recover some useful evidence. What they found instead was beyond their wildest imagination. Not only was this definitely their crime scene, the place looked as though it hadn't even been cleaned. There was dried bloodstains in various places around the room, especially on the carpet, one of the mattresses, and a bedspread. I mean, I don't know that I'll ever be staying at a Holiday Inn again, but there's no denying it was an incredible development for investigators. That wasn't even all they found either. In a garbage down the hall, they found a plastic bag from Walmart that had a used pair of latex gloves inside. They were the exact brand that had been purchased by the man in the surveillance video, and there was even a receipt for the suitcase that Summer's body had been found in. With all of this in hand, detectives were confident. They decided it was time to confront their suspect. However, the stakes were still high. Now, it wasn't just about getting justice for Summer. The question was, would police be able to bring closure to Joanna's family as well? When Lubbock police showed up at Rosendo Rodriguez's home with a search warrant and told him that he needed to come in for questioning, he didn't even ask why he was being taken in. Instead, when detectives informed him that they were investigating the murder of Summer Baldwin, He said that he wanted to tell his side of the story. During the interview, Rosendo stated that he met Summer on the evening of September 11th while he was out after training. They hit it off, he invited her back to his hotel room, and she accepted. Once there, he said they got intimate, which he claimed was totally consensual. It was afterwards, he said, that things went off the rails. Rosendo explained that at some point, Summer pulled out a crack pipe and started smoking right there in his room. He said he disapproved of this, so he took the drugs away from her. That's when she pulled out a knife and attacked him.
She pulls out a knife. It's one of those little yellow fold-out ones. And she stands up, and she comes towards me. At that point, I'm thinking, don't cut me, please.
Rosendo said that he knew in that moment he was in a fight for his life. He said he put Summer in a headlock and tried to get her to drop her weapon, but she kept trying to stab and slash him. He stated that in the heat of the struggle, they had fallen onto the floor. He kept trying to restrain her until suddenly she just went limp. He said that after that, he panicked.
My arm came around her neck like that. And I tell her, hey, quit, drop the knife. I'm starting to struggle. We fall kind of like towards the bed on the, like where the chair on the table is. And I let her go. She was lying across from where the carpet meets the tile floor from the bathroom. At this point, I'm panicking. I'm freaking out. She's lying on the floor. She's not moving. Sitting there, I'm scared.
Of course, none of this story really made any sense. Police knew from Summer's autopsy that none of the injuries she had suffered were consistent with a knife fight. She had no cuts on her body, and neither did Rosendo from the looks of it. Instead, Summer had been brutally beaten. Also, as I said before, there was very good reason to believe that, based on her wounds, the sexual encounter between her and her killer was not consensual. There were other obvious questions, though. If this was truly an accident or self-defense, why hadn't Rosendo attempted to call for help? Instead of trying to help Summer or perform CPR, why had he gone to Walmart to buy a suitcase and other items to cover up what had happened? When asked about this, Rosendo didn't have a very convincing answer.
You still had the presence of mind to go ahead and then go to Walmart and make these purchases of a suitcase of the gloves and come dispose of the plot. How come during that process did you not call 911?
Because I immediately at that point I thought, my God, what did I do? I panicked about my career in the military. How it would I just panicked. I can't. I don't know how I would do it.
The idea that Rosendo was acting out of panic also didn't seem to fit the evidence police had collected so far. The steps that he had taken after the murder were methodical and calculated, and in the Walmart surveillance video, he looked completely calm, like this was just any old shopping trip. At this point, detectives were not worried about their ability to prove their case against Rosendo for Summer's murder. They had collected even more evidence during the search of his home, including the exact shirt he was wearing in the Walmart surveillance footage, as well as data on his computer that revealed he had been searching for information about the case and his own name following the killing. In addition to this, police obtained receipts proving Rosendo had rented a new red pickup truck while he was in Lubbock for training that weekend. Analysis on the latex gloves from the hotel would show his DNA on the inside and Summer's on the outside, and the blood evidence in the room was a match to Summer as well. As I hinted at before, though, what investigators were concerned with now was the Joanna Rogers case. A search of Rosendo's cell records revealed that he had called the teen's house twice, just 15 minutes apart on the morning of her disappearance. This, plus his name on that list of internet contacts, was enough to convince police that Rosendo was involved. But unfortunately, there wasn't much else to work with. That being said, police did have one idea. So, because Summer was pregnant at the time that she was killed, this was a capital murder case. That meant that Rosendo was eligible for the death penalty if convicted. Figuring they could appeal to his sense of self-preservation, authorities decided to offer him a deal. If Rosendo revealed what he had done with Joanna and agreed to plead guilty, prosecutors would request that he receive a life sentence instead. I should say, investigators agonized over this decision, and it wasn't something that they wanted to do. But they spoke to Summer's family, and they agreed too that if this meant Joanna's parents might get some answers, then they were on board. Rosendo eventually went for the deal and told detectives what he claimed happened. Again, his version of events painted him as the victim and were almost certainly a complete lie, but here's what he said anyway. Rosendo stated that on the morning of May 4th, 2004, he had arranged to meet up with Joanna. He picked her up from the alley behind her house and said they had a consensual sexual encounter in his truck. Just like with Summer, Rosendo claimed that it all went bad as soon as this was over. He said it was only then that Joanna revealed her true age, after which she demanded money and stated she intended to blackmail him. Rosendo said he panicked and ended up choking Joanna to death the exact same way he claimed he killed Summer. He said it was all self-defense, and he was just trying to calm her down. These weren't the only details that were nearly identical either. Rosendo said that after Joanna was dead, he went back to where he was staying and grabbed a suitcase. He said he put her body inside and then threw it in a dumpster. Rosendo ended up revealing exactly which dumpster he had placed the suitcase in, and using this information, police went to workers at the Lubbock City landfill who were able to give them somewhat of an approximation of where the contents of that dumpster might have been emptied. I have to stress, though, when I say an approximation, I still mean an area that was the size of several football fields and buried under 2 years' worth of garbage. Despite the challenge, police and an army of volunteers went out into the scorching Texas sun and dug through that mountain of trash. Miraculously, in October of 2006, so 29 months after Joanna was first reported missing, they found it. The suitcase with her remains inside. It was a huge moment for everyone who had been touched by the case in any way. I mean, the odds of finding Joanna were so low, and though it was incredibly sad, it came as a real comfort to her loved ones. At the very least, her parents finally knew what had happened, and they were able to give her a proper burial. If you were angry before about the plea deal that Rosendo Rodriguez got, well, I've got some good news for you. On the day he was supposed to enter his plea, he backed out and claimed he had no idea why he was there and that he hadn't done anything wrong. This decision shocked everyone, but it meant that the death penalty was back on the table. Prosecutors withdrew their offer, and they started preparing for trial. The one frustrating thing about this was that because Rosendo had only confessed to Joanna's murder as part of the deal, it meant that nothing he had told police could be used in court. The result was that, like before, only Summer's case was strong enough to put in front of a jury. That being said, the case was pretty overwhelming. In the end, Rosendo Rodriguez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Rosendo would spend nearly a decade fighting his sentence, but in the spring of 2018, he was executed for the crime. According to reports, he spent his final moments going on an unapologetic rant. He never took accountability for anything, and once again played the victim, saying that people should boycott all Texas businesses until the government felt pressured enough to abolish the death penalty. Now, I'm personally not a fan of the death penalty, but even I don't see how that was supposed to work. In any case, neither Joanna nor Summer's loved ones wanted or expected an apology from Rosendo. Joanna's father summed it up this way, quote, "An apology wouldn't have made a bit of difference. He just cared about himself. Just a sociopath." Rosendo Rodriguez was pronounced dead at 6:46 p.m. on March 26, 2018. Like I said at the beginning of this video, the thing I keep coming back to with this case is the incredible odds of everything. Just the idea that so many little things lined up in order for this one to work out the way it did, and for justice to finally be served. And it all started with a tiny little barcode on a piece of luggage. In my opinion, that's pretty wild. Of course, the other thing that's been weighing heavily on my mind about this one is the way Summer and Joanna were portrayed in news reports. More so Summer than Joanna, but the complete lack of interest in their lives from the media is just really heartbreaking. I'm sure there's going to be some people in the comments section that will feel compelled to point out that Summer and Joanna were engaged in risky behavior, But to me, that is so far from the point. These were beautiful young women with their whole lives ahead of them, and regardless of your opinions about their choices, we should all agree that no one deserves to be brutalized in this way and thrown out like trash. Life is complicated, and we are all so much more than the worst things that have happened to us and the questionable decisions that we've made. I think Summer's mom summed it up the most simply in an interview we came across. Quote, "She was just a really happy person, and she deserved to live."
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, everyone, and take care.